Welcome to an audio Odyssey. The book of the same title was originally published a decade ago, and in the time since, much additional documentary evidence and information regarding Kiss in 1981 has been uncovered. Since a second edition of that book seems unlikely, I thought it would be an interesting and fun challenge to create an Elder supercut, a multi-part audio documentary of sorts exploring varying facets of the Elder's genesis and era. The goal is to keep the assorted chapters concise and focused and purposeful in both standalone and serialized contexts. In this episode, the wait for the first recording sessions with producer Bob Ezrin at Toronto's Phase 1 studios.
Well, right after the end of this tour, which is December, they're going to take a month off, and in January they'll start to go into the studio. They'll start writing songs, doing some basic tracks, and I would say the record will be recorded, produced, and mixed between January and April at the outset, and then it'll go into release immediately after it's finished. So I would look for another Kiss album sometime in the mid-spring.
That was Glickman and Marks, C.K. Lent, detailing Kiss's 1981 plans to Melbourne's 3XY during the Australian tour. If only things had been that simple. On January the 6th, the nominees for the 1981 Juno Awards were announced by the Canadian Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences. One of the top-selling albums of 1980, Pink Floyd's The Wall, was represented in both the International Album and Single of the Year categories, winning both the following month. However, the album's Canadian co-producer, Bob Ezrin, was missing from contention in the Producer of the Year category. Perhaps on a criteria technicality, but it was still noted as something of a snub in the music press considering the scale of that album's art and commercial success. Missing too were the Kings. The Canadian group had scored a CRIA certified gold album for their Ezrin-produced debut, The Kings Are Here. Ezrin did receive a Grammy nomination for The Wall, but that Album of the Year award was part of a clean sweep by Christopher Cross's Sailing album. Bob Ezrin suggested in June 1981 that he had practically decided to give up the recording industry altogether following his experience with Pink Floyd during The Wall. He had fallen out with Roger Waters following the end of the project. Mark Blake's Comfortably Numb and Nick Mason's Inside Out books support that Roger cut Bob off for several issues, including blaming him for revealing the scope and scale of the album's tour production to a journalist prior to opening night. Oddly, that indirect faux pas had been repaired enough for Bob to nearly have produced Roger's Radio Chaos album in 1986. Calling The Wall a challenge would be an understatement as epic as the album itself, with the clashes of egos involved and Bob's attempts to mediate between David Gilmour and Roger. But Ezrin's contribution had been core to the transformation of Waters' original concept within the fractured band environment and assortment of external pressures that the group were facing. The resulting body of work speaks for itself. In the aftermath, Bob didn't quit producing and was working with then seven-time Juno Award winner Murray McLauchlan, primarily country folk artist seeking to broaden his commercial appeal. As Murray told the Calgary Herald in November 1980, Ezrin was a very inventive cat, and he wanted to work with someone else and learn to do something new. He expected the resultant album to be very different from his previous work. For McLauchlan, the album was a big deal. He'd signed a potential $1.4 million 7-record deal with Asylum Records for U.S. distribution on January the 13th, partially on the strength of putting his career shift in the hands of Ezrin. The album would be the first he hadn't self- or co-produced in 10 releases, and he finally had a real recording budget to play with. But he was also willing to turn over the vision and guidance for the project and let Ezrin drive. As he told the Canadian press, in fact, as far as staying interested in what I was doing, I really needed a radical change, fresh input from the outside. I wanted to merge with someone whose bright ideas might create something I didn't see out of what I did see. In hindsight, that rationale for his engaging Bob might illustrate several analogues to issues facing Kiss in 1981. Signing on to produce Kiss made Ezrin's already busy schedule complicated. In addition to finishing Murray's Storm Warning album using Toronto's Manta Sound in February, he had been reportedly scheduled to produce Toronto's second album for the Solid Gold label. Instead, he started working on the King's second album, Amazon Beach, at Ezrin Farms and Phase 1 Studios in Toronto. There was an overlap with the Kings' David Diamond and Zero doing session work during the McLauchlan sessions. Clearly illustrated by the final product generated from those two projects, Bob was still very much Bob.
And you gotta stay. Nobody said that it would be fair. But what we didn't know was that you never know. I always thought that you would be there. All the way, did the two of you go all the way, all the way.
Murray's folksy "If the Wind Could Blow My Troubles Away" received a lavish, Floydish, or perhaps Beth-like treatment backed by the Summerhill Children's Choir with orchestration by Alan Macmillan. It was a standard treatment from Bob's tactical toolbox, deployed successfully with Alice Cooper and Kiss to elevate appropriate material. Bob also contributed to the songwriting and added musical performances where needed. But his richly layered and textured productions were signature elements and part of his appeal as a producer who could execute a plethora of functions for an artist and their material. Kiss already well knew that Bob could be a sonic architect, sculptor, and painter, impacting all facets of the creative process. While that may have scared them in 1976, they now needed that functionality. Production work for Storm Warning had wrapped by early April. By that time, Gene Simmons had already visited Ezrin at his farm to discuss the Kiss sessions, though the Kings have moved up in the queue. The Kings have been working on pre-production during gaps in their road itinerary. The Amazon Beach recording sessions starting in March eventually provided a contrast of opposites for the group. With their first album, they had been rookies, and Bob's craft had elevated their material. He heard promise buried within their near-complete debut and persuaded them to re-record it with him, with some adjustments. A year later, they were more seasoned, had performed more, and had spent more time crafting their new material, some of which had been debuted at the end of their touring cycle. They may well have thought that they had learned all they needed from the master. Bob deployed a Cooper Kiss audio playlet to open their album. In hindsight, Guitarist Zero thought that Bob was adding things haphazardly, making changes to song arrangements and feel, more for the sake of change than need. Zero recalled that Bob was clearly stressed at the time, juggling the multitude of demands on his time and mind, and was often not punctual for sessions. Hindsight, particularly after an unsuccessful project, is always 20/20. The word juggling likely has a somewhat negative connotation in this context, but here it isn't meant in such a way. For a producer, working with multiple acts simultaneously could often be a very normal workflow. There was always work to be done for the next act they'd be working with. Recording sessions weren't necessarily continuous or contiguous, so overlap didn't suggest neglect or mismanagement. Pink Floyd's album had been recorded over the course of a year with at least 6 studios utilized, some for varying purposes, availability, or specific need. The first McLauchlan sessions took place at New York's record plant in October 1980, eventually utilizing studios in Toronto, Nashville, and Los Angeles. The Kings, more budget-limited, used Ezrin Farm and Phase 1. That was an arrangement that suited Bob, who preferred at the time to work closer to home where possible. In April, it was anticipated Bob would finish up that project in early June. On the 13th, the text for the next Kiss Army newsletter was being finalized. This issue featured some of the publicity fluff pieces that were being provided to the wider press. This issue included the stories based on Gene's pyrotechnician purportedly causing a fire emergency during a photo session and Paul filling his jacuzzi with cold gin. More importantly, several song titles were teased from the recording sessions, notably Ace's Don't Run, which is useful for dating purposes. That song was initially based on a riff that Anton Fig had come up with. Anton later recalled that Ace had simply taken the guitar riff and turned it into a complete song. A demo circulates, along with several alternative endings.
You got problems, so does everyone, so does everyone. You don't want me to give you charity, so use your mind, 'cause it's all you got. Well, your body's not too bad. You're so uptight, now don't give up, girl. That's the way to handle it. Just stand and fight, and use all your might, use all your might. Don't run, got to take the stand. Don't run, good things are ahead.
Another project Bob was involved with was the St. Robert Separate School's presentation of Jesus Christ Superstar, the musical which ran April the 8th through 11th. Bob was credited as a sound advisor on the production. The cast was also taken in to record a soundtrack commemorative at Manta Sound, with Ezrin serving as executive producer for the Loyal Orange Players. The performance was independently pressed onto vinyl following editing at Phase 1. Needless to say, he was busy, but a schedule was worked out with Kiss that allowed him to continue to fulfill his various obligations. It's important to note that the suggestion for Ezrin's recruitment had come from Polygram A&R. The decision to go with that option served multiple functions. Most importantly, it gave the group leverage with the label against their delivery date deadline. Seemingly acquiescing to the label's preference may have offered the illusion of cover. That Allcoin noted the Polygram president and CEO's particular support of Ezrin indicates that the awareness of their creative pressures in the background had made his choice an equally pragmatic decision. Allcoin and the band were clearly fully invested in working with Bob, so took care of their own activities during the downtime prior to a new round of pre-production starting. While the members wrote and prepared ideas for pre-production, there was the ever-present business of Kiss to attend to. Meetings with Bill, finance, Glickman Marx, international interviews, etc. The press office was being brought back in-house under Allcoin VP Rick Alibert. During early 1981, Bill Allcoin recruited publicist Ida Langsam, following her work at the Howard Bloom organization where she'd been tasked with publicity for Peter Criss's Out of Control album. Ida had gotten Peter his People magazine feature, impressing Bill. During the year, Louise Greif would also move to Allcoin as publicity assistant. Ida immediately started working with Kiss to look at fresh new ways to maintain press visibility during the off-tour period and studio downtime. This meant getting to know her clients to generate the ideas for publicity stories. Once she had met with the band members individually, on April the 16th, she suggested additional meetings with the band members the following week, noting,
I feel it is imperative for a group meeting to be set up to discuss the direction of the forthcoming publicity drive. In my individual meetings with you all, several new angles were explored that can be implemented, some immediately, some over the course of the months of recording, and the rest once the new LP is released.
Soon afterwards, news pieces started appearing in various publications. The stories were core to her publicity approach. She explained in 2015,
anecdotal press releases to get across the personality of the individual artist, so that the reader, ultimately the fans, but the intermediary being the journalist, would know something about their lives, could relate to them, could feel like they know them, which makes them feel closer to the artist.
The releases were intended to create an increasing degree of interest prior to the album's release. Following the Shorter Hair pieces in April, May saw the Ace Beer, Australian tour wrap-up, and Eric Porsche stories planted. On May the 2nd, members of Allcoin's stable of musical acts and management and Glickman Marx assembled for a competitive softball game. Gene Paul and Eric joined the Glickman Marx Cheaters against Ace, Anton, and others on the Allcoin All-Stars. The latter were victorious, winning 18-12, but Paul was named MVP. In June, news pieces followed in the music columns on Kiss's inclusion in the America Now cultural exhibit on display in communist Eastern Europe, and Paul's purchase of a Tiffany lamp in between jetting via Concorde to London and taking in Broadway shows. It's not clear how Paul purchasing a new Tiffany lamp for his collection would relate to the group's core demographic, but as they say, no press is bad press. Gene cut his hair and had started looking for acting opportunities that aligned with his desire to potentially escape from the confines of Kiss. He filmed a screen test for a pilot of a potential ABC television show, Grotus, on April the 7th. Gene had been approached by Marcy Casey, producer of Happy Days, Mork and Mindy, and Soap, to try out for the show. Gene clearly had an itch in need of scratching and was starting to take more concrete steps towards screen action. Paul also cut his hair shorter, and in comments provided to Lisa Robinson's Rock Talk syndicated feature in April, he suggested an element of indecision about the band's future internally. He said, "We still don't know exactly what we'll do next. You have to move on."
Keep on moving. Move on.
He and other members were reported as trolling the current music scenes of New York and London, trying to get a feel for what was going on. On the face of it, and in conjunction with the reaction to the material generated during the first sessions at Ace in the Hole in February, they were flailing for directional inspiration. Ida recalled for the Odyssey project.
The band was going through turmoil. They were questioning everybody. Should we take the makeup off? Should we leave it on? Should we take it off? Should we leave it on? We're gonna take it off. No, we've changed our mind. We're gonna leave it on. No, what do you think? Should we take it off? It was like every day there was a different decision. Everything was in such a state of flux.
It wasn't just the music that was a challenge. In the background, there was the tick-tock of the contractual clock that had commenced on May the 16th, 1980, when Unmasked had been delivered to Phonogram. The massive contract, with its potential for financial boon, was also a sort of Damocles. Moreover, the lifestyle of Super Kiss, while providing the illusion of grandeur and extravagance, also had a flip side that included doubt, fear, and anxiety. Kiss were rapidly running out of time to meet the contractually defined deadline for delivery of the new album. As previously noted, international affiliates were clamoring for product at the start of the year. But in some ways, having not been inspired by the February sessions and awaiting Bob Ezrin's full attention, group and label were hamstrung. A band off the road without new release product is also a money drain, particularly at the scale of Kiss's management and business managers. If the recording advances amounting to $500,000 had been paid following the request made to Polygram and Phonogram in late February, then the monies remaining after various management commissions were taken from the top would have drained rapidly. Inactivity was expensive. Some activities may have taken place in mid-April, with Eric noting in his journal a rehearsal scheduled at Matrix Sound Studio A on April the 14th. Certainly, the initial recording schedule was communicated to the band members by Aucoin on April the 14th, with pre-production for the first 5 songs scheduled to begin in New York on April the 28th. Even at that time, Aucoin clearly knew that Kiss would miss the Phonogram MRO, minimum recording obligation, delivery date deadline of June the 16th, anticipating a best-case scenario where the album's mixing and overdubs would not be completed prior to mid-July. That would put the release at plus 90 days or so, in agreement with the affiliate request for more time for promotional activities. Additionally, memos between AMI and Polygram in March indicate that Aucoin didn't expect the album to be released prior to September at the earliest. Again, it was a best-case scenario. By April the 17th, the schedule had changed, with rehearsals rescheduled for SIR Studio D April the 23rd through the 25th, without Bob. He joined them for 4 days in Studio B from April the 28th. The band conducted further rehearsals in Studio A the week of May the 4th, again without Bob. During this time, it's probable that band members were rehearsing separately, potentially at Ace in the Hole or in other places preparing material for the sessions. The first Ezrin sessions were scheduled for weekdays May the 11th through the 22nd, and some of the band members flew to Toronto for the first recording sessions at Phase 1. Ace wouldn't be present following his involvement in an unfortunate automobile accident in his driveway on May the 12th. It's not clear whether this delayed and/or prevented his presence in Toronto. Canadian Polygram issued a press release noting the accident.
Ace's limousine pulled into his driveway, with plenty of time to pick him up for the band's first day of recording, what will be their 17th album. Heavy rains the night before had left the ground knee-deep in mud, and the limo proceeded to become firmly entrenched in the soggy ground. Ever the gallant gentleman, Ace decided to pull the black beast out and hopped into his four-wheel drive Jeep. As he was tugging away, the chain suddenly broke, sending the Jeep forward with a lurch and Ace head first into the windshield. The Jeep went crashing on into Ace's Corvette and Mercedes SLC. After hitting one of the marble pillars at the entrance to the house, the Jeep finally came to a stop against the wall of the Fraley mansion.
The incident was also reported in the local Wilton Bulletin, with Ace reportedly using his Doberman to drive the press off his property, telling one reporter, "Don't ever let me catch you on my private property or I'll let this dog go and bite your neck off." That same day, Gene was scheduled to be interviewed by the Illinois entertainers Mike Carroll about his act space. Rough mixes for 5 tracks were completed on May the 21st. These were instrumentals and included Silly Girl, Every Little Bit of Your Heart, Eric's Better Than Anton, It's My Life, and Sentimental Fool. Dynamically, there wasn't much difference from the material the band had worked on at Ace in the Hole in February. The material continued within that stylistic framework, the polished sound of an established musical group. But the Phase 1 recordings still illustrate a band closer to the sound of Unmasked, with Bob simply as a surrogate for the role Vinnie Poncia provided. There were only hints of the heavy metal that had been mentioned in late 1980. From the circulating versions of the rehearsals for those 5 tracks, it was clear that Kiss had no sense of unified direction at the time. The material was a mixed bag of tempos and may have included ideas not fully developed during the previous session. The tongue-in-cheek Eric's Better Than Anton recording was clearly the basis for the track issued on the Revenge album following Eric Carr's death in 1991. We'll leave the psychological micro-analysis of the title to others. In its 1992 form, it became Car Jam 1981, but was also referred to in fan circles as Heaven. The Phase 1 recording served as the basis for Frelly's Comet Breakout, completed with lyrics by Richie Scarlett in 1984. Kiss struggled to find a use for the idea at the time and were unsuccessful marrying the instrumental with a vocal melody. Eric recalled as published in the Kiss Neon Glow fanzine in 1992. "We tried, all during the recording of The Elder, to write lyrics for this thing, and nobody could figure out what the hell to sing to it. That was one of the few things that Ace and I worked on separately. We couldn't get anywhere. It just kind of sat there. Clearly, to be useful, it needed to be more than Eric Carr's Moby Dick." However, Gene was complimentary of both Eric and the idea when discussing The Elder with Australian radio station 3XY in November 1981.
Yeah, we're proud of him. I think he's the... You should hear some of the songs that we didn't wind up using. We had an untitled piece that Eric had written that didn't wind up on the record for time reasons and for obviously too much material, where he does a drum solo that's just out of this world.
Paul recalled the history of the song in Hit Parader magazine in 1992. He said, "Our producer, Bob Ezrin, was going through our old tapes right when we started work on this album. He came across the great drum solo that Eric had done right after he joined the band. We didn't even know it existed. When we heard it, we figured it had to be incorporated into the album in some way. We figured that song was a fitting way to end an album that's dedicated to Eric Carr's memory." In its transformed state, Ace's guitars are stripped from the original and replaced with a fresh rhythm and newly inspired lead. The original count-in is only present on the Argentine cassette mix and is shortened on other versions of the album. It proves conclusively the veracity of the source material. The first 30 seconds, or what might be considered the first verse, follows the original drum track. But where the first chorus would have transitioned, there's an up-neck guitar string scrape transitioning directly into the drum solo. Completely purged is some 1 minute and 41 seconds comprised of verse, chorus, verse sections repeated, and the front of the break is used to transition to the solo. Here, Bruce lays down some tasty licks to suitably launch the featured section, which is, of course, Eric Carr's drum solo. As the chorus section returns at the end of the solo, the 1992 version is quickly brought to conclusion, while the original meanders on for an additional 40 seconds, with another repetition of the chorus, verse, chorus sections before the hard ending. It should be stressed that the solo is left unmolested and matches the original recording from May 1981, and the editing is functional to give focus to Eric Carr's performance, as Paul Stanley noted. Bruce's replacement of Ace's lead was also very necessary, and at least allowed him to honor his friend directly. The title of Heaven, attributed to the recording, seems apocryphal and may have been made up when some of the Elder instrumentals first surfaced in collectors' circles. Certainly, Gene mentioned no title in 1981 and may have been reticent to disrespect Anton. Additionally, he may never have seen the cassette song title. Every Little Bit of Your Heart had reached the stage during rehearsals where Paul was clearly seeking the vocal melody. Musically, the track had a thick bass line and lots of guitar harmonics leading into swept chords. The basic arrangement is concise and clearly defined. The partial chorus idea is light and airy, longing, and somewhat melancholy. A second verse elevates the drums with chords backing guitar fingerpicking, again with bass as the primary melodic driver. All come together in the third verse section. An extended chorus meanders somewhat before returning to a chorus that repeats out. A second take of the rehearsal includes Paul's rough vocal. It's his first stab at lyrics. The first two lines of melody is coincidentally similar to the beginning of Little Anthony and the Imperials' 1965 hit, Hurt So Bad, which Linda Ronstadt had taken top 10 in 1980.
I know you don't know what I'm going through.
It's a very minor shared starting point, and Paul's composition immediately deviates lyrically and musically, with the I Want You Only line, which provided a title for some bootlegs. Clearly, it would have been a more emotional song, though one with some complex musical dynamics. The similarities between parts of the rehearsals and A World Without Heroes are somewhat superficial. The parallels are most noticeable on the bass line and the initial minute of the song, before the piece changes tempo and style. At phase 1, it's Bob redefining the melodic line, accompanying the group on keyboard where Vinnie Poncia might have done similar in 1979 and 1980. Right from the beginning, the latter song's melody is clear, as the driving melodic element, superseding the bass and weaving in and out of the guitar chords and drums. Structurally, the overall track remains faithful to the rehearsals. But it becomes clear why Gene may have latched on to Bob's transformation of the melodic structure when Paul abandoned the piece. His contribution elevated something musical, only hinted at during rehearsals. However, the chords in the break section now take a form that could be inspirational for parts of Just a Boy. A pair of It's My Life rehearsals have long circulated. The chord structure is most similar to the music realized on the 1982 version of the song, ultimately released by Wendy O. Williams in 1984. Phase 1 recording offered a full 5-minute arrangement, complete with breakdown section that foreshadows Raise Your Glasses years later. Oddly, it stumbles to a halt as if the players had simply run out of gas, repeating the riff at the end. The process of elimination led to the attribution of the correct titles for the remaining 2 instrumentals in 2022. First, Sentimental Fool. The drums and bass on that year's Creatures box set clearly mirror the 1981 instrumental, so aligning the title with that from the known Phase 1 tape didn't take much effort. And that's all that's present on the Creatures box, albeit with a shortened arrangement and increased tempo. The song idea was revisited in early 1982 with Michael James Jackson reviewing leftovers from various other sessions for the initial recordings that resulted in the Kiss Killers tracks. By that time, there had been additional rework of the concept with Bob Kulick contributing to the lyrics, resulting in its transformation and retitling as Tell It to a Fool. Then again, it could equally have been a root idea that originated with Bob, similar to Naked City. 3 rehearsal takes circulate with slightly differing break sections. At Phase 1, Bob played an important melodic role again, adding keyboard flourishes, potentially assisting the search for a vocal melody. Once again, the underlying bass line drives the song, with an R&B tinge, but the keyboard anchors it firmly in the sonic realm defined on the Unmasked album. Even the guitars are more AOR, pop-styled, precisely the sort of material the group were hoping to break away from. The nearly 7-minute track is the longest of the Phase 1 cuts. Fragments of the song were also transformed when the project pirouetted along a conceptual basis. This was not the heavy metal band members had promised. Finally, there's the ludicrously titled Silly Girl, which was also included on the Fancy Fair bootleg with the title Kicks Are for Kids. 3 takes of the rehearsal have long circulated, 2 featuring a Fraley guitar solo. The Phase 1 recording is near identical in form to the rehearsal take without the lead, though Eric is playing various fills during the break section, not too dissimilar to Anton Fig on Two Sides of the Coin the previous year. It's the most up-tempo or hard-rocking of the 5 tracks currently known to have been recorded during May 1981. One would hope that were there ever to be a super deluxe treatment of The Elder, that the memories of the reasoning behind those titles on the rough mix cassette would be probed. first Ezrin sessions complete, there was a break for promotional activities in Austria. Planning for the Vienna trip had been ongoing throughout May, with production coordinator Jane Grodd insisting on a Concorde return flight due to the involved band members' recording schedule at the time. Ace Frehley and Eric Carr were the band members intended to participate, with Bill, Rick Alibert, George Suet, John Hart, and Laurie Greenan as part of the traveling party. Laurie would be assisting with one last use of the Unmasked costumes. There were concerns at AMI about the costs involved in the trip, and ultimately the travel did not include the supersonic flights. Nor did the event include Ace, with Gene replacing him following the mid-month issues that had impacted his involvement in the recording sessions in Toronto. The party took an overnight flight from JFK on May the 29th, arriving in Vienna via Frankfurt mid-morning on May the 30th. They stayed at the President Hotel, and the Rennbahn Express magazine-sponsored event took place at the Vienna Town Hall on the evening of May the 31st. It was a good opportunity to present a PR moment to the German-language press, with 13,000 screaming fans attending, though Gene and Eric simply participated in an onstage interview during the multi-artist event. They received the Best Rock Band in the World award from the magazine on behalf of the band. Presented by football star Hans Krankel, the KISS members appeared oblivious to the Rapid Vienna's players' role or popularity. Gene also threw copies of the Tomorrow single into the audience. Both members had cut their hair by that time, so they wore wigs, so as not to give away any of the surprises that would be coming. Prior to their on-stage appearance, they were interviewed briefly backstage for the OK magazine. Asked about the new album, Gene was reticent to discuss it.
It'll probably be done in September, but not before then.
Does it take you such a long time to produce an album?
Takes about 3 months, but this time we're going to take our time with it. And we're really not going to talk very much about it because it's all going to be new songs, all new surprises. So it's a secret.
New surprises, and you don't want to tell me a single thing about the surprise?
Very much, except that they're new songs.
17 minutes of raw footage circulates from the event, with the somewhat awkward backstage interview also touching on Gene and Eric's first visit to Vienna, touring in Australia, and the importance of the fans. Also interviewed on stage, Gene was again asked about the new album.
We have a new album coming out in September, but we're not going to talk very much about it. It's going to be a big surprise.
Big surprise.
Big surprise. We don't really want to say too much about it. Just okay. A lot of new songs, a lot of new surprises.
Habt ihr es gehört? Es gibt im Herbst ein neues Album von KISS, aber kann überhaupt nichts darüber sagen. Es ist eine ganz, ganz große Überraschung. Es sind eine Menge unheimlicher KISS-Songs drauf. Hat Gene gemeint.
Rick Alibert later joked to Paul and Ace that Gene and Eric had performed an acoustic set, including Simon & Garfunkel material for the audience. The entourage got out of Vienna rapidly, leaving early in the morning of June the 1st for a flight to Frankfurt and then onward for the return to JFK. While in Vienna, there had been business meetings with Roy Cottrell, Phonogram's international promotion executive, and others to discuss the status of the album, 2 weeks away from deadline day. A June the 3rd telex to Aucoin and Phonogram executives confirmed parts of those discussions, including the expectation that KISS would deliver the production parts for a new single, album artwork, fresh biography, and band photos by July 15th. The full album would still be expected to be delivered by the end of July, they agreed. This indicates that the delivery date, while still past the MRO, had slipped only slightly at that juncture, and that a September release was still at least anticipated. Clearly on the surface, the project was all systems go per the original intention. The optimistic April schedule intended the group to record the second batch of songs in Toronto between June the 15th and July the 3rd. Pre-production would have taken place in New York, June the 8th to 12th. A May the 26th memo from George Suet noted a minor shift in plans, in part likely made necessary due to the interruption of the Vienna trip. Vienna wasn't the only travel being planned during 1981. Aucoin was working with ATI's Jeff Franklin and Latin impresarios Jose Rota and Carlos Pedro Spadone to book a Latin American tour. In late June, a 10-date tour had been agreed, which would have been comprised of the group's first visits to Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico starting in January 1982. Rota had booked Queen's early 1981 tour of the area, so he appeared well-placed to do the same with KISS. He later told Billboard magazine, "Before the tour, Queen's sales in Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, and Mexico were only 100,000 units. 3 months after the tour, they had reached 700,000. What are the record companies waiting for?" That economic impetus expanding KISS in previously undeveloped or neglected markets had already entered KISS's business thinking, along with their decline at home. With that still in flux, and Europe-Oceania having been exploited during 1980, it made sense to look elsewhere. But they may have been unaware of the different way of doing business in Latin America, Rota also warned acts. You have to know that it takes half a day just to have a cup of coffee. Chile was ultimately dropped from the itinerary, and the tour was tentatively scheduled to begin January the 9th in Buenos Aires. 2 shows in Argentina would be followed by 4 in Brazil, and then 4 in Mexico. The tour would conclude in Puebla, some 60 miles from Mexico City, on January the 31st. Additional groundwork went as far as scheduling a promotional visit to Mexico. The band, though, had to continue working on their new album. Rehearsals instead of pre-production were scheduled to take place at SIR Studio B starting June the 8th. It was anticipated that Bob would participate. Gene was certainly lurking around New York at the time, attending a Citizens Committee for the Children of New York benefit with Miss Ross on June the 10th. The process of creating the visuals for a cover concept were also discussed at AMI in late May, with one employee submitting their ideas for the album title. Those ideas included The Sky's the Limit, All American Guys, Ear Openers or Open Ears, Higher Ground, and the hilariously ironic In the Flesh. One can only imagine the concept being discussed in that meeting that provided inspiration for those ideas. On June the 5th, Howard Marks presented a budget for the cover shoot, amounting to $16,000 for the neon-infused session. By April 1981, even before recording sessions had started with Bob, hints were being dropped to newspaper gossip columns that the band were about to change musical directions and that they were considering unmasking. While the purpose of the disposable news bites was simply a matter of calculated visibility maintenance, some may have been created based on comments between Ida and the band members. In hindsight, they appear almost prophetic. It's interesting to consider that the group's facilitating about image and musical direction may have made them more malleable to external ideas. In late 1980, they were adamant that they didn't need outside input and knew what they were going to do and where they were going creatively.
The new album we're working on, we're producing ourselves, and it's back to heavy metal, back to what we always have been.
In mid-1981, it was clear that they didn't, that they were creatively self-doubting and clutching at straws, which may have amplified the slightest suggestion made to them. Following Gene and Eric's return from Vienna, the transformation of the sessions was underway, and Aucoin was going to gamble on negotiating a further extension of the deadline for the release of the new album to buy the band the time they needed for a full creative reset.
You will regret this day.
Something strange, inexplicable, and/or amazing had happened. By June the 12th, Bill communicated to all parties that a delay until October the 1st had been negotiated with Phonogram. The project had taken an unexpected turn, though it's impossible to pinpoint when that change took place. Bill was adamant, communicating internally to the core parties within the group of management.
The repercussions for not delivering by this date is the possible loss of our contractual deal with Polygram, and or at best, a renegotiation of our contract which obviously would not benefit us.
All parties were very much aware of the risk being undertaken through the new creative departure. Clearly, Morpheus had entered the conversation.
I think you're going to like this.
At the end of June 1981, the band were in creative flux, indecisive and lacking inspiration, but they were fighting hard to try and move forward. The first Toronto sessions provide a useful cutoff point between the next Kiss album and its predecessor. Though it's understandable in hindsight why those recordings may have been deemed less than inspiring by the group. During the first 2 sessions of 1981, the group had created the basis for the contractually minimum 9 songs, but some were simply too close to the AOR sound of Unmasked that they knew they had to escape from to reconnect with their heavy rock roots. Other ideas were too disjointed, or too structurally similar, but if they couldn't reconnect with their rock roots, what could they connect with?
Even your precious talisman can't stop what's going to happen.
The genesis of the Elder concept will be explored in a future installment. Special thanks are extended to Tim McFate for his incredible work conceptualizing and executing the Novelda project that evolved into the Odyssey books. The majority of those interviews were his idea and work and remain an invaluable contribution to documenting history.